Titanic, built to be unsinkable. Her captain and crew, the finest of their day. The night, moonless, still and calm, crystal clear.
Eyes ahead!
And yet, the greatest maritime disaster in history. The indestructible, destroyed, and abandoned by a nearby ship.
It seems impossible to believe that the captain and officers knew of our distress and deliberately ignored it.
Many questions still surround that night. Among them, the biggest and most crucial mystery of all. Why? How could this have happened at all?
So she's at Titanic's wreck site. That's incredible.
He's traveled the world, collected data, examined thousands of hours of testimony.
The more I read about the truth of what happened, the more I realize how strange it really was.
For the first time ever, new research will help explain the mysteries behind the tragedy. Tim Moulton is one of the world's foremost experts on the Titanic. His journey to uncover the truth behind the tragedy has taken him across the world. Here in Las Vegas is the object of his lifelong quest. Dragged up from the ocean floor in 1998 and put on exhibition amongst the casinos, showgirls, and magic acts. "15 tons of the hull of the Titanic, pulled up from 2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic. Bringing up and exhibiting a piece of the wreckage is highly controversial. But to Tim, it's a chance to stand face to face with history.
She's here. This is the Titanic. This is what was built in Belfast 100 years ago. And this is a testament to how beautifully built she was. She's like a work of art. Every rivet, literally handcrafted. It's extraordinary to be standing this close to it. It's almost as though Titanic's come back from the dead and sort of hit me in the face almost, because she's here.
Tim has devoted his life to understanding what really happened that night in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. As a piece of machinery, Titanic seems invincible.
What you can see here from this 15-ton piece of the Titanic is the strength of it, just the sheer... We don't build things like this today anymore. The way, its heaviness, its strength, the way the rivets were heat sealed into it and shrunk onto this very thick shell plating here. And even over here, you can see the glass. The thickness of the glass is absolutely amazing. I mean, that is nearly 2 inches thick. This ship is built like a battleship.
1909 is a remarkable year. The world's biggest and strongest ship, symbol of the might of the Industrial Revolution, begins to take shape. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, Titanic's keel is laid. At the same time, 2,000 miles away in the ice fields of Greenland, an armada is launched. Thousands of icebergs are carving off from the glaciers and begin making their way south towards the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. By April 1912, the unsinkable Titanic is being crewed by the best mariners in the world, with passengers determined to be part of the maiden voyage. Back in London, Tim surrounds himself with all the available scientific and historical research he needs to plot and understand that night, moment by moment.
Over the years, Titanic has become a myth, and as we go on, we get further and further away from the truth. And what I wanted to do is wind the clock back to 1912, to almost put myself in that position there, and to really learn about the environment as well, and to find out exactly what happened that night.
Tim has been obsessed with Titanic since he was a child. To help him understand it better, he even rebuilt the ship for himself.
When I was about 11 years old, I got some glue and plans and cut them up, and just actually gluing them onto cardboard and actually starting to see the profile of Titanic come to life off the page. It really makes the Titanic become a real ship that you understand the geography of.
Tim built his model using the plans of Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. The designs were so similar that there were no blueprints for Titanic herself. But now, based on first-hand accounts from survivors and the reconstruction made after her discovery on the ocean floor, Tim has this complete, accurate layout of the ship. In her day, Titanic is the largest moving object ever made. She is 1/6 of a mile long, 175 feet high, and divided into 11 decks. The top deck houses the navigating bridge. The next 5 decks include exquisite first-class staterooms and luxurious architecture, such as the spectacular grand staircase. The bottom 3 decks are reserved for crew, cargo, and machinery. This extraordinary vessel was moved through the water by 3 giant propellers, which were powered by engines generating nearly 60,000 horsepower.
Titanic was a floating city, capable of carrying 3,500 people, and she had fabulous facilities. She had a squash court 2 decks deep, she had a swimming pool, and she even had a gymnasium complete with a rowing machine.
The first-class dining saloon is located in the center of D-Deck. It is one of the most stable positions on the ship. One more detail designed to maximize the comfort of the passengers. Finally, on the 10th of April 1912, Titanic raises anchor and sets sail. Destination, New York. With a maximum speed of more than 23 knots and a weight of 46,000 tons, Titanic's journey begins. But from the very start, there are ominous signs.
One of the lesser-known facts about the Titanic is there was a fairly serious coal bunker fire raging in Titanic that began at Belfast, where the Titanic was built, and they put out the fire on Saturday night. So it took them nearly the whole voyage to get the fire under control.
Titanic is carrying passengers from every class of society. Hundreds of immigrants from many countries, British citizens who are hoping to make a new life in America. Others returning home after holidaying in Europe. Colonel Archibald Gracie IV was a graduate of West Point Military Academy. he was traveling first class back to New York.
I enjoyed myself as if I were in a summer palace on the seashore, surrounded with every comfort. There was nothing to suggest that we were on the stormy Atlantic Ocean. The motion of the ship, noise of its machinery, scarcely discernible on deck or in the saloons, day or night.
Despite its huge scale, the true genius of Titanic is in its details. It is as genteel as the finest cafes on the continent. On the lower deck, freezer stores mean that the restaurants and cafes are stocked with the finest fresh produce. The Café Parisien, out on B deck, is accompanied by a view of the North Atlantic passing by the French windows, a first on any ship. Inside in the restaurant, the first-class a la carte menu has 11 courses, including oysters, sirloin of beef, peaches in chartreuse jelly, and chocolate and vanilla desserts. Other luxuries are equally suited to the fitness fanatic, Colonel Gracie.
And when Sunday morning came, I considered it high time to begin my customary exercises, and determined to patronize for the rest of the voyage the squash racket court, the swimming pool, the gymnasium, etc. I was up early, before breakfast, preparatory to a swim in the 6-foot deep tank of salt water, heated to a refreshing temperature. In no swimming bath had I ever enjoyed such pleasure before. How curtailed that enjoyment would have been had the presentiment come to me, telling how near it was to being my last plunge, and that before dawn of another day, I would be swimming for my life in mid-ocean.
All this time, the ice field has been making its way further south and is now completely blocking the shipping lanes. The deadly icebergs and field ice are a looming threat directly ahead of Titanic. Meanwhile, the passengers are enjoying their trip, safe in the knowledge that they aren't on a brave adventure into the unknown. They're so confident because the North Atlantic liner routes are as reliable as railway lines. Thousands of ships regularly cross from east to west and back, with set routes known as steamer tracks. Titanic's journey will take exactly 7 days.
For a lot of people in first class, for example, business people, they might do this journey once a month, for example. They were always doing it, and they didn't expect it to be a trip into the unknown. They expected to arrive on Wednesday morning, and that was it.
It's Sunday, the 14th of April, 6:30 p.m. Titanic has her lookouts high up in the crow's nest. Other ships on the steamer tracks had radioed warnings of the ice ahead. She's on alert, but traveling full steam ahead, confident that she can cope. Today, it's inconceivable that a ship could be steaming into an area of ice protected only by the eyesight of its lookouts. One of the reasons is the existence of the International Ice Patrol, which tracks the path of icebergs in the North Atlantic. The International Ice Patrol was set up as a direct consequence of the disaster. Oceanographer Don Murphy is their chief scientist.
Don, I'm interested to know, where do the icebergs come from and how long do they take to get there?
The icebergs in the western North Atlantic, the ones that enter the shipping lanes, come primarily from the west coast of Greenland. And then down the coast and eventually along the coast of Labrador, and then towards the shipping lanes and into the area where they become a very severe danger to the North Atlantic mariner.
The freezing swathe of water that carries the icebergs is called the Labrador Current. In the 2-year journey south, the water keeps the icebergs dangerously large for a dangerously long time. Eventually, this frigid current, with its deadly cargo, cuts into the warmer Gulf Stream.
We do know that 1912 was a very severe iceberg year. Over 1,000 icebergs entered the North Atlantic shipping lanes during 1912. The average is a lot less than that, around 500 a year is the average. So it was a very severe iceberg year. The existence of so many icebergs does give us the understanding that the Labrador Current was bringing a large number of these from the north into the shipping lanes. And one of the things that we have to be very careful about is the location of these Labrador Current areas that have relatively very, very cold water in it and, of course, preserve an iceberg.
Today, we have the technology that would warn a ship of the exact whereabouts of the icebergs it's heading towards. April 14th, 1912, 10 p.m. In a short space of time, it's gone from warm weather to freezing cold. The water is calm, and a blanket of stars fills the sky. The air is clear as far as the horizon. Perfect visibility. The entire safety of the ship now depends on her watch officers and the lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee.
Another thing that's been blamed for the Titanic disaster is that the lookouts didn't have binoculars. And it is true that binoculars were scheduled to be in the crow's nest, but they weren't in it for that journey. However, having read all of the inquiries and listened to testimony from the captains of all the major transatlantic liners, what I know is that the best way of spotting ice at night is with the naked eye. And the last thing the officers on the Titanic wanted was the lookouts messing around with binoculars.
Titanic and other ships in the White Star Line prided themselves on having a dedicated lookout crew. In clear visibility with the naked eye, they should be able to spot an iceberg on the horizon. That means at least 20 minutes warning. If there is anything out there, the captain will know about it in time.
What they wanted was a quick 3 sharp rings of the bell, which means an object dead ahead.
For some of Titanic's passengers, the bars and restaurants offer entertainment well into the evening. For others, like schoolteacher Lawrence Beasley, it's time to turn in. He's in his cabin on D-deck.
The quietness of the night was broken only by the muffled sounds that came to me through the ventilators of stewards talking and moving along the corridors. Nearly all of the passengers were in their cabins, some asleep in bed, others undressing, and others only just down from the smoking room and still discussing many things.
On the bridge, Titanic's engines are at full speed ahead. Now traveling at more than 22 knots, she's almost at top speed.
One of the most common explanations that people give for the cause of the Titanic disaster is that she was going too fast. And yet, when you look at the evidence, what you see is that captain after captain testifies to having experienced it to be totally safe to keep to full speed in ice in clear weather.
Another version posits that Captain Smith is drunk on duty, but it's his firm policy never to drink while at sea. He's one of the finest captains, given responsibility for the greatest ship. His popularity is such that he's called the millionaire's captain, and he's doing everything by the book.
That night, the weather was completely clear, so Captain Smith was doing only what all the other captains would have been doing, which is keeping a sharp lookout.
They're being extra vigilant because of the warnings from other ships. Tonight, a smaller 450-foot steamer, the Californian, has passed 3 large icebergs and radioed a warning to all ships. Titanic acknowledges the message. Now at about 10:30 p.m., the Californian finds herself blocked by a huge ice barrier, almost 30 miles long and 3 miles wide. She is captained by Stanley Lord. He's one of the youngest and most promising captains on the North Atlantic. Soon after he stopped at the ice barrier, he notices a ship approaching.
Evening, officer.
Evening, sir.
When I came off the bridge at 10:30, I pointed out to the officer that I thought I saw a light coming along. And it was a most peculiar night. And we had been making mistakes all along with the stars, thinking they were signals.
She appears to have no wireless.
We could not distinguish where the sky ended and the water commenced. You understand, it was a flat calm. He said he thought it was a star, and I did not say anything more.
Let's go to the
And I said, let us go to the wireless and see what the news is. But I met the operator coming. And I said, do you know of anything around? He said, only the Titanic. And I said, to me, it doesn't look like the Titanic. There's no doubt about it.
Lord is convinced that he's looking at a small steamer and is sure that, unlike Titanic, it doesn't have radio. He tells his radio operator to put in another call to Titanic, which must be elsewhere. In Titanic's radio room, the operator is under pressure. The ship has just arrived close enough to the United States to begin sending telegrams direct to shore. And there's a huge backlog of messages. In order to hear the distant signal, Jack Phillips has turned his headphones up to full volume. On the Californian, Cyril Evans types out his warning. But he has no idea how close Titanic is. His ears ringing, Phillips has no patience for any interruptions. Evans has done his best to relay his warning. His 16-hour shift ends and he leaves his post for the night. He is the only radio operator on the Californian. Titanic is now only about 10 miles from the Californian, but cut off from the nearest source of rescue. It is 11:30 p.m. Titanic is steaming through a massive ice field in the darkness, confident that she can see an iceberg in time to avoid it. But just 10 minutes later, her luck runs out.
Ice ahead! Ice ahead! Ice ahead!
The iceberg isn't 20 minutes away. They spot it when it's almost on top of them. Something has gone terribly wrong. On the bridge, the crew put the engines into reverse and turned the wheel to avoid the iceberg. Despite her size, the Titanic is highly maneuverable. Instead of slamming straight into the iceberg, it manages to begin turning away. The hidden ice shelf rips along Titanic's hull. The Titanic is so large, many passengers have little idea of what is happening. Lawrence Beasley is on D-deck, near the stern of the ship.
There came to me what seemed nothing more than an extra heave of the engines. Nothing else. No sense of shock, no jar that felt like one heavy body meeting another. The thought came to me that they must still have further increased the speed. And all this time, the Titanic was being cut open by the iceberg and water pouring in aside. And yet no evidence that would indicate such a disaster had been presented to us.
One of the most common myths today is that Titanic was somehow badly built, or the rivets were weak, or the metal was brittle, and I can assure you that's a complete myth. Basically, the builders were actually encouraged, if anything, to spend more money on the ship, not less. The damage that was caused by the iceberg to Titanic was equal to 1 million foot-tons a second, and that's like an explosion. And basically, even a modern battleship would have been sunk by that sort of impact.
At the afterbridge on Titanic's stern, Quartermaster Thomas Rowe is absorbed by the lights. They're electric, an improvement on the flickering oil lamps of old, and surrounding them are coloured patterns caused by ice crystals in the air. Rowe calls them whiskers round the light.
I glanced forward. A windjammer, sails set, seemed to be passing along the starboard side. Then I realised it was an iceberg, towering perhaps 100 feet above the water. The next instant, it was gone, drifting astern into the dark.
In just 5 seconds, Titanic's watertight compartments are ripped open along 200 feet of her hull. The apparently unsinkable ship is fatally wounded.
I think many people believe that it was purely PR and advertising on behalf of the White Star Line that they claimed that Titanic was unsinkable. But actually, what we get from reading all the evidence is that her builder, Thomas Andrews, actually believed she was unsinkable. And even Captain Smith, on the Sunday night, was explaining to his dinner guests on Titanic how she could be cut crosswise into 3 pieces, and each separate piece would float.
Titanic is built with 16 watertight compartments. The worst accident the designers could imagine was a collision with another ship, flooding 2 of them. Even if her first 4 had been flooded, she would have stayed afloat.
But what happened that night was a freak sideswipe disaster which took out 6 watertight compartments, and that kind of sideswipe disaster has never happened before or since in recorded maritime history.
Ironically, if Titanic had hit the iceberg head-on, it would have likely survived. But the damage caused by the iceberg was literally unimaginable. Soon after the impact, Lawrence Beasley realizes that something is wrong.
And so, with no thought of anything serious having happened to the ship, I continued my reading. And still the murmur from the stewards and from adjoining cabins, and no other noise. No cry in the night, no alarm given, no one afraid. But in a few moments, I felt the dancing motion and vibration cease suddenly. The engines, that part of the ship that drove us through the sea, had stopped dead.
Beasley makes his way to the upper decks to find out more. Whilst down below, the ship's designer examines the damage and discovers the ship has less than 2 hours to live. 47 minutes after impact, Captain Smith gives the orders to send out a radio distress signal and load the lifeboats with women and children. A common belief is that Titanic simply didn't have enough lifeboats for all her passengers and crew. The truth is more complicated.
In 1912, the Board of Trade was trying to make ships become watertight and become lifeboats in themselves. And the Board of Trade actually rewarded you with having to carry less lifeboats if your ship was properly subdivided. They believed that the best way to save life at sea was preventing ships from sinking in the first place, not having dangerous ships with lots of lifeboats on them.
Over the next 1.5 hours, 18 lifeboats and rafts are lowered down the side of Titanic and are eventually loaded with only 700 of the over 2,000 passengers and crew. With no more women and children nearby to fill boat 13, Lawrence Beasley is ordered to jump in. Meanwhile, still on board Titanic, Colonel Gracie sees what he thinks is a last chance for rescue.
To reassure the ladies, of whom I had assumed special charge, I showed them a bright white light that I took to be a ship about 5 miles off, and which I felt sure was coming to our rescue.
Captain Smith orders an attempt to signal the nearby ship with the message, "Come at once, we are sinking." But they cannot make out a response.
But instead of growing brighter, the light grew dim and less distinct, and passed away altogether.
On the freezing sea, the lifeboats row to a safe distance from the doomed Titanic.
As the oarsmen pulled slowly away, we all turned and took a long look at the mighty vessel towering high above our midget boat. I know it must have been the most extraordinary sight that I shall ever be called upon to witness.
On the giant Titanic, 1,500 people are left stranded as it lurches into the water. Colonel Gracie tries to make his way towards the stern.
Ahead of us was a mass of humanity, trapped against a railing, unable to move. As the ship keeled over forward, I believe their bodies were caught in the angles of the deck or entangled in the ropes and sank with the ship. Down I went. Seemed a great distance. I held my breath for what seemed an interminable time, till I could scarcely stand it any longer. And it was then the thought that this was my last moment came upon me. Just when I thought that for lack of breath I would have to give in, I was given a second wind. Well, finally I noticed by the increase of light that I was drawing near the surface. Now, though it was not daylight, the clear, starlit night made a noticeable difference in the degree of light just below the surface of the water.
Gracie eventually finds his way onto a lifeboat. Hundreds of others are less lucky, and within minutes begin freezing to death in the icy water. "16-year-old Jean Hippack witnesses the horror from Lifeboat 4.
You can't think what it felt out there alone by ourselves in the Atlantic. You know what they say when you see a shooting star, someone is dying. And we thought of that, for there were so many dying not far from us.
As people freeze to death around them, the survivors can only think of the mystery ship that failed to come to their rescue.
The pity of it. So near. And so many people waiting for the shelter its decks could have given so easily. It seems impossible to believe that the captain and officers knew of our distress and deliberately ignored it.
The Titanic, brought down by an iceberg, and the victims apparently ignored by a nearby steamer, which could only be the Californian. Two great unsolved mysteries of that tragic April night. Eventually, 1,517 people died, men, women, and children. The impact of the disaster reverberated throughout the world. The Titanic, the great hope of a generation, had failed.
Being in this boat, which is obviously much safer and with all the modern equipment, it gives me an insight into how those Edwardian people with women and children in nightgowns and things, they were out there in a boat not much bigger than this, in the wide Atlantic, with bergs probably even bigger than that, some of them. It was really sunny that day, and they would have been carving off as well, so the Titanic survivors, they'd have heard that occasional crump and crash and splash and roar in the distance as the icebergs toppled over. Fourth Officer Boxall, who was the navigating officer on the Titanic, he explained that as soon as the screams had died down of the drowning on the Titanic, he could hear the water on the ice. And he could hear what he called the rumble of the ice. And just out there, I could hear the rumble of the ice.
Tim's deep understanding of all the literature, from first-hand testimony to the best scientific research, is what makes his work so unique. And there is a huge amount of material. Titanic is, in fact, one of the best documented disasters in history, the subject of massive public inquiries. In New York and London, 180 witnesses were subjected to 50,000 questions.
As soon as the survivors came off the Titanic, they gave their interviews to newspapers who slightly embellished the stories. And what I've been interested in doing is getting back to what people who were there actually experienced.
On the Titanic, eyewitnesses include Colonel Gracie, Lawrence Beasley, and Gene Hippack. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. On the Californian, Captain Lord and Apprentice Gibson. They all have something to say about that night, written in books or questioned under oath at the inquiry. Tim's reading of the thousands of pages of expert testimony has helped him dismiss so many of the so-called facts explaining the tragedy.
She had very good experienced lookouts. She had the most experienced crew. She was, in fact, the best built ship. She could turn on a sixpence, effectively. Having looked at all of these theories of what may have caused the Titanic disaster, you can actually see that each one falls apart on close scrutiny. So we're still left with a question. What really was the underlying cause of the sinking of the Titanic?
And the second question, just as mysterious. Why did the crew of the ship that was close enough to come to its aid appear simply to look on and do nothing? For Tim, there is only one way to solve these questions.
For me, the facts are absolutely key. There are hundreds and hundreds of books on the Titanic, but the only ones I'm interested in are ones that were written by people who were there, or ones which are the transcribed testimony of eyewitnesses.
Going over the witness statements, what becomes clear is that the night wasn't as perfect as it first seemed. It was almost too perfect. A canopy of stars, brighter than anyone had ever seen before, the unnaturally flat, calm ocean, and the sudden, almost supernaturally freezing cold.
It was just a keen, bitter, icy, motionless cold that came from nowhere and yet was there all the time. The stillness of it, if one can imagine cold being motionless and still, was what seemed new and strange.
Even the hugely experienced crew noticed how unusual it was. Charles Lightoller was the second officer on Titanic.
Lightoller talks about it dropping 4 degrees in the half an hour that he was having his tea, and the carpenter then goes to stop the fresh water freezing up, and yet they'd been sunbathing on the deck just before. All of the survivors mention how sudden the drop in temperature was, and how extreme the drop in temperature was. So what I wondered was that by investigating the temperature, maybe that could give us a clue and be a way into unlocking the true cause of the Titanic disaster.
Not only were there huge icebergs waiting for Titanic, but perhaps a bigger, more ominous threat over the whole tragic event.